I did not say you hello, Joanna.
I think we can start now. Everyone is connected.
Okay, so a warm welcome to all of you. The Task Force on Carbon Pricing in Europe and the Chinese think tank, the International Finance Forum, have been co-organizing this event with the participation of the American Paulson Institute. We do think that stopping the rise of carbon emissions globally and reversing the trend in the near future is a necessity to succeed the fight against global warming. And it is feasible if we adopt the proper means. We consider that the price of carbon is a major device because the objective is to shift from fossil fuel to carbon-free source of energy. On the eve of the Glasgow COP26, we have gathered experts, policymakers, and members of the business community from all continents in the world. During 2 hours and a half, 32 persons will participate to the conversation, and I must say this is a real challenge. So I beg you to strictly abide by your allotted time, no more than 5 minutes when it is an intervention, no more than 3 minutes for a contribution, and 1.5 minutes for short reactions. Now, let us start the discussion with Laurent Fabius, the former head of the milestone Paris COP21. Laurent, what are your expectations from the Glasgow COP26 and in this respect about the introduction of carbon pricing in the debate? Laurent.
Thank you, Edmond, and hello to everybody. I'm very happy to be with you. In 10 days, we have the start of Glasgow COP26, and before we have the important session of G20, which to a certain extent will be decisive. Obviously, there are big differences with Paris, in particular, the general framework. Paris was important. It has become the landmark. And my hope is that Glasgow will be, anyway, it must be, an accelerator of action. Now, if I'm more specific, I hope that 4 objectives can be achieved. The first one is rather technical but important, is the adoption of what we call the Paris Agreement rule book. It seems to be technical, but in fact, it's not only technical, it's important. And reaching a consensus on the calculation method of carbon prices could help to move this process forward. Therefore, the first objective is the adoption of this rule book. The second one, which is obviously more important, deals with finance. You know that there have been commitments, not from Paris, but from Copenhagen in 2009. And today, as far as public and private financing towards developing countries are concerned, the figures are not met. And obviously, there has to be new effort in that direction. And more generally, and to a certain extent, in a more important way, we have to have a development of private financing in the direction of fight against climate warming and green technologies. Second goal. The third one is the fact that climate ambitions have to be enhanced. You know the figures, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. And when you look at the most recent figures, we are not in line with these objectives. And our friend Antonio Guterres has even said that the pathway, the real pathway, was catastrophic. Therefore, I hope that Glasgow will be able to move forward on closing the gap with climate ambition. And the fourth one is to take into account several important evolutions in the Paris Agreement. And I mean the interconnection between climate warming and biodiversity. I mean the fact that the importance of social justice, climate justice, and the fact that more and more sectors and different elements are taking into consideration carbon pricing. Now, and I come to my conclusion because I have to be very, very quick, like all of us. What strikes me is that on all these issues, carbon pricing is one of the keys and maybe the key. But however, it is true to say that carbon pricing will not be discussed as such during the Glasgow COP for different reasons, and mainly because there is no international agreement on this very important, very decisive question. Therefore, we shall see that, and I'm hoping that, and I'm sure that the discussion will be very interesting. Glasgow will not make a decision on this, but carbon pricing will be at the background of many discussions. And it is very important that whatever the results of Glasgow are, we, all of us and many others, and particularly US, China, and Europe, we must keep on trying to develop carbon pricing and to make understand to general public and to decision makers that it is probably the most efficient tool to use for our common goal.
Thank you, Laurent. Now, Lord Turner, the President of the Energy Transition Commission. We have been working with you on the so-called sector approach. Could you now give us your expectations about its introduction in the COP26 discussion? Adair, following you.
Thank you, Edmond. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we need to get the whole world to net zero by around mid-century, and we need to get about 35% emission reductions in the 2020s. On the first half of those, there's a lot of good news. 70% of the world GDP is now covered by some or other category of net zero target. Some of them need tightening, but I think they will have a real impact. Once you have net zero targets, you change the behavior of companies and sectors. The crucial thing, however, now is to focus on the 2020s. And I think it is tightening there, which is far more important than tightening of the net zero targets. And if you take up all of the national determined contributions which have been put in as part of the Paris process and add them up, they do imply some reduction in emissions in the 2020s, but nothing like enough to get us onto a 1.5 degree centigrade pathway. There is a gap in 2030 of order of magnitude 15 gigatons between where we need to be and what the NDCs would commit us to. So a crucial thing that we have to discuss now and at COP and subsequently is how do we close that gap between the NDCs and where we need to be. And the Energy Transition Commission put out a report last week called Keeping 1.5 degrees centigrade Alive, Closing the Gap. We identified 6 technically possible actions, which are both technically possible and crucially do not need global universal agreement of all the parties to the Paris process, but could be pursued by leading coalitions of countries and companies. 3 of those are, I think, good news because I think they are, in some sense, potentially easy wins, areas where we could reduce emissions at very low cost of abatement or indeed negative, and where indeed I suspect that progress will in any case be faster than in the NDCs. And those are accelerated road transport electrification, they are improvements in energy productivity and efficiency, and crucially, and we're going to come back to this in today's agenda, they are reducing methane emissions, in particular from the fossil fuel sector. 2 of the 6 require the flows of climate finance to which Laurent just referred. If we want to get not merely no new coal, but a close down of existing coal before end of useful life, somebody will have to pay for that. And if we want to end deforestation, somebody will have to pay for that. And those are the 2 priorities of climate finance. But the 6th and final one of our objectives is where I think carbon pricing is clearly important. Technically, as we look in detail at what could happen in the cement sector, the steel sector, the shipping sector, and other sectors like that, we are now more confident than we were even a year ago, not only that they can get to net zero by 2050, but that they could, with sufficient public policy support, deliver significant reductions even in the 2020s. In particular, last week, the Net Zero Steel Initiative produced a report saying that the steel sector could get to net zero by 2050, but could deliver a 35% reduction in emissions even in the 2020s if there was a serious carbon price. So I think we really need to focus not on carbon pricing as a generalized concept, but on how it can accelerate the decarbonisation of these hard to abate sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Adair. Victor, when the IMF, Victor Gaspard from the IMF, is arguing for a carbon price floor, don't you think that it would be at least a promising step if in Glasgow we started discussing an agreement among the largest emitters? Victor, a very brief reaction, 1 minute half. Victor.
Laura, Edmond, as Laura has already said, and also Adair, carbon pricing is clearly in the background of the discussions. Carbon pricing is observable and easy to understand, so it is a natural instrument for global cooperation. We have shown in our research that an agreement with only 6 large emitters in alphabetical order, Canada, China, the EU, India, US, and UK, would be enough to put the world in a good path to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees. And even if we don't go for a global international carbon price floor, the way forward will be to accept measures as equivalent to carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is providing the grammar of the argument for global cooperation, Edmond. Thank you.
Thank you. Jairam Ramesh, the former Minister for Environment in India. Jairam, what are, from an emerging country, the expectations from COP21?
Well, I think, let me say, I'm not presumptuous enough to speak on behalf of all emerging countries, but as somebody who has participated in previous COPs, I think the first thing I would say that we need a sense of realism as to what these COPs can deliver and cannot deliver. And I think the most absolutely, bottom line delivery at Glasgow should be the rule book of Paris. I mean, it's really unconscionable that 6 years have gone by, and we do not have a rule book which makes the nationally determined contributions, the monitoring, the reporting and the verification of them transparent and accountable. So I think that's the first expectation I would have from Glasgow. The second expectation I would have is, I hope people don't get sidetracked into this whole net zero business of 2050 and 2060, when very few of us will be around to be held accountable. And therefore, I endorse the suggestion made a little while ago that it's really the 2020s and 2030s, the doables in the 2020s and 2030s, the milestones in transport, the milestones in energy, the milestones in agriculture, the milestones in industry, that need clarity and that need agreement. And the third and final point I'd make, and I'd underscore what Mr. Fabius said. It's delighted to see Mr. Fabius once again, but to underscore the point that he made, that in this entire global discourse on climate change, biodiversity gets stepmotherly treatment. It gets to the side. But along with the UNFCCC, we had the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and there's an intimate nexus between the loss of biodiversity and what we are seeing on global warming and climate change. So I would expect to see in Glasgow a greater recognition of what countries do in the area of biodiversity and biodiversity management. I think that's absolutely crucial. So these are my three expectations from Glasgow, but I'm realistic. I really think that the COP structure is a cop-out structure. It's really not a COP structure. It's a cop-out. It's not guaranteed to deliver outcomes in a time-bound manner. And I think we need to create alternative architectures. And what has happened in the case of methane, for example, is a good case study. We've had the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. That's also a good confidence building measure. But I think we need a series of these confidence building measures rather than to look for some big bang miracle to emerge out of Glasgow. We need a series of incremental steps in the 2020s and 2030s.
Thank you, Jaram. Now, Domenico Siniscalco, you have been a member of the IPCC. Your feeling about the ability of COP26 to meet its call for urgent and efficient action?
Well, as everybody said, I believe we must be realistic in this COP. The first good news is that there is the IPCC just released has sounded the alarm on the state of the climate and stressed the very urgent need. There is no more need to discuss whether it is man-made or not. It's made by man mostly, and we must address it urgently because of that. Coming to the conference, I believe there are three key questions which embodied their answers. First question, should we try and build a global coalition like in Kyoto and Paris, no matter how long and painful, or should we aim at three blocks coalition, the three blocks being US, China, and EU? I believe this second option is more realistic and more important, and these three blocks account for most of the emissions in the world. Second question, should we leave the coalition building, the agreement as a standalone process, or shall we try to link other negotiation and other incentives to promote the coalition? I believe there is, of course, room to do that. And finally, and this has been already discussed by all the speakers, how do we coordinate this COP with the zero net by 2050? And I believe the current focus on the 2020s is more important. So I believe we are in agreement, and now is up to the leaders to discuss these issues in a constructive way. The most recent signals from the US are not particularly encouraging, but let's see how the discussion develops in Glasgow. Certainly, there is a lot of urgency in reaching a conclusion, if possible, an agreement, if possible.
Thank you, Domenico. We now come to the heart of the issue. Tom House of the International Energy Agency. The energy transition is an economic problem in the first place to meet the demand for energy, which will not stop increasing globally. How to cope with the phasing out of carbon emissions? Tom, could you please give us the term of the equations?
Happily, good afternoon, good day to everybody. Greetings from here, from Paris at the International Energy Agency, where to help set the framework for the whole COP discussion, we published earlier than usual our World Energy Outlook last week, which sets the framework and just gives the order of magnitude of the changes to the energy sector that we need to see. Adair Turner referred to some of the big numbers in terms of the reduction in terms of fossil fuel consumption in final consumption. But the other thing that's important is the growth we're expecting to see in electrification, much more use of electricity in transport, in buildings, in industry, and the general growth in the use of electricity as countries, including developing countries around the world, grow their consumption just to meet basic energy needs and energy access needs. So there's great change expected in the energy sector, in all sectors, and that has to be financed. And there are a range of tools that everyone talks of to help cope with this financing arrangement. But here today, the key focus is on the role that the carbon pricing can play in its different forms, whether it's an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. There's different ways it can be introduced. It's a very flexible tool, but according to the dashboard of the World Bank, we have to date, we have about 64 jurisdictions, national or subnational or supranational around the world, 64 different types of carbon taxes and pricing schemes, which is a good sign, and they're quite new ones. We have the example of China as the largest example to date. So despite the magnitude of the change needed, it's great to hear that the focus being put on what we need to do in the next few years, that we're focusing on the short term. So given that order of magnitude, given the need to take action now, we can focus on the different role pricing instruments can play in different markets and talk through the details of how we can implement such markets today.
Thank you very much, Tom. Christian Gaulier, as an economist, could you explain why it is so necessary when we talk about carbon pricing to generalize it around the world?
Thank you, Edmond. Well, let me be clear on one thing first. Economists usually disagree on everything, but in the case of climate change, there is a strong consensus for carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is in the face of this myriad of action that need to be done by a myriad of actors. Carbon pricing is the right instrument to force people to internalize the negative externality they impose to others. It's also a mechanism that makes sure that we align the private interest with the common good. And let me be also clear on something else. The typical critique to carbon pricing is about redistributive effect. It's true that any action that increases the cost of electricity or the cost of energy has a negative impact on redistribution because the income elasticity of the demand for energy is smaller than one. So poorer people devote a larger fraction of their income to purchase energy. And therefore, when you increase these costs, you increase the inequalities. However, I mean, so it's true, for example, when you impose a feed-in tariff for solar electricity, that increases the price of electricity that is paid by poor people in particular. So the advantage of carbon pricing compared to these other strategies is that you create a carbon dividend that you can use to organize this redistribution. And if some government want to do it, we could even use this money to overcompensate the poorer household. And my last point is on the Fit for 55. As you know, in July, Europe decided the European Commission proposed this package, Fit for 55. We are here with a credibility issue. I mean, probably Europe is the region of the world where we really want to try to transform this commitment into a strategy. And I think it's extremely important. Let me mention two things that are particularly important in this package. The first one is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that is not only there to organize the level playing field, but it's also there to incentivize our trading partner to adopt carbon pricing. And I think it will be key. And also, when I hear a negative point, I don't see in Fit for 55 a proposal for a carbon price floor. that should be there in order to reduce the uncertainty and to increase the credibility of the carbon pricing project in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Martin Wolf, could you make a brief contribution in the spirit of your columns in the Financial Times on the geopolitics of global warming and its relation to carbon pricing? Martin.
Yes, okay. But it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, inevitably, some of my comments have already been made. I do think that we are in a sort of Augustinian situation. The governments are all agreeing that we should have climate chastity, but not yet. And the pleasures of procrastination are obviously enormous. And I therefore very powerfully endorse the need to go for the 2020s as the focus. Now, in terms of the politics, I'll just divide them into two elements. The geopolitics are pretty clear. As Vitor has stated, it needs agreement among a limited number of great powers. Leaving aside all the other problems, the point that hasn't been emphasized is that relations between the great powers, particularly between the West and China, are breaking down pretty well comprehensively. And our ability to handle climate issues in any way depends on agreement between these powers. And right at the moment, the prospects at COP26 don't look to be too good, given that the Chinese government will not be represented at the highest level. So the geopolitics in this absolutely fundamental way are going to be very, very difficult. The second issue, it is more domestic politics, and it's my last, which fits in with the geopolitics, is of course this extraordinary reluctance to use carbon prices and carbon taxes. And I'm really been very fascinated by it. Most of our governments are seriously cash strapped. Most of them would like to raise money somehow. Everybody agrees this is desirable, efficient, and will give them quite a lot of revenue in the short to medium run and achieve a great global end. And for some reason, they can't do it. Now, the question is, why can't they do it? Well, maybe at a suitably high level, not just a notional price. Well, perhaps the tax is too visible and they're frightened of the gilets jaunes and their equivalent. Perhaps it's because they can't work out whom to compensate and how, because there are lots of difficult questions about who to compensate and how. But the very big issue is industry opposition. All the industries that really are polluting have resisted this fiercely. And one of the reasons they use for that is, of course, if we raise our prices, we won't be competitive because of all these terrible governments around the world which won't raise their prices. And that's why I've become a very strong supporter, my last point, of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This might trigger a trade war. We need the trade war. It's time to get tough.
Thank you, Martin. Listening to the International Energy Agency, it is clear that renewable needs a major boost if we want to succeed. So Gabriel Gauthier, as an executive in one of the major oil and gas firms, please, can you give us some brief clues about your own strategy towards renewables and about the bold decision of an internal price of carbon of 100 euro per ton by 2030?
Thank you very much, Edmond, to give us the opportunity to share with you that, in fact, a price of carbon helps us in the huge turnaround that we're about to do within Total. I was in charge of the decarbonisation businesses of Total, and I can tell you, for all the major investments that we do in renewables, in low carbon energies, we do need a price of carbon. Some people still doubt that we are really serious about the move we want to make. We already have 8 gigawatts in renewables under operations, and we plan 35 gigawatts by 2025 and 100 gigawatts by 2030, with over 30 billion investment in the next 4-5 years. So we are really serious about that. How will the price of carbon help us do this and also decarbonize our own facilities and also engage in huge investments in the decarbonisation sector. I was in charge also of the carbon sinks and of hydrogen. So these are long-term investments, and we need a price of carbon. First, we welcome the Fit for 55 package because the CO2 price enables us, by raising the price of fossil fuels, enables this switch that we make from fossil fuels to renewables in all sectors, also for our customers. And we're getting ready for shipping, for transport, for the heating in buildings, and also to decarbonize our new facilities by the Go Green project, which powers with renewable all our refineries in Europe. We will save, it's 5 gigawatt, we will save 2 million tons CO2. How do we do that? In each of these investments, the massive hydrogen investment that we plan, the CCUS, and we were bullish because we took FID on Northern Lights, we plan these investments by taking a price of carbon, which today is $40 per ton, and by making a sensitiveness of $100 per ton after 2030. This is how we do it. And this is the only reason why sometimes we engage in these long-term projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Li Min of the Chinese Institute for Atomic Energy. In the Chinese endeavors to push nuclear, how do you praise the role of nuclear for carbon reduction in China?
Okay, thank you, Edmond. I will give a brief introduction on China's carbon reduction endeavor on nuclear. The DHR, deep for low temperature heating reactor, a clean nuclear reactor dedicated for district heating. Nuclear makes up 10% in world electricity supply, but only 0.2% in district heating. Nuclear should play a more important role in world heat supply. China has an ambitious carbon reduction plan, but China's reliance on coal makes heat production particularly carbon intensive, so we need more vigorous policies and measures. The DHR is part of China's solution to carbon reduction. The 400 megawatt reactor can provide heat for around 10 million square meters and reduce carbon emission of 520,000 tons of carbon a year. The reactor is safe, simple, and economically competitive. In November 2017, China has completed the first step principle verification, providing heat for 2 office buildings using a similar design reactor. Currently, we are working on a demonstration project in Liaoyuan, Jilin province. We have received the first stage permission for the project from the National Energy Administration of China. It is planned to provide district heating with no carbon dioxide in late 2024. Thank you.
Very important. Thank you so much, because I think that without nuclear, we will not succeed in the energy transition. It's absolutely clear for me, as for many, many people around the world. So now a word on hydrogen. Now, no effort rules on the development of clean hydrogen, the core of your concern now, a short reaction on its prospects, and to this effect on the role of carbon pricing. Noé.
Thank you so much, Edmond. So clean hydrogen is indispensable, according to IEA analysis, to decarbonize the so-called hard-to-abate sectors like industry, heavy-duty transportation, and also to provide longer-term energy storage. So it's not the silver bullet, but it's kind of the missing link in the energy transition next to nuclear and next to green electricity from renewables. Now, it's very good news is that hydrogen is also one of the Glasgow breakthroughs, which is positioned for the summit. So that's very good news. But of course, clean hydrogen is still relatively expensive. So it will need to come down, the cost of that, in the next 10 years. IEA thinks in the next 10 years, by 2030, it might be cost competitive to fossil fuel alternatives. But we have a cost gap. Now, to bridge that cost gap, it is very important to have a good carbon price. Carbon pricing is critical and key to bridge the cost gap between clean hydrogen and the fossil fuel alternatives. And for instance, for the Netherlands, I've seen calculations that if you have a carbon price, an ETS price of 125 euros per ton by 2030, it would cut the cost for public subsidies in half. So it's very, very, very important. However, last point, the carbon pricing is necessary for clean hydrogen scale up, but it is not sufficient. So in addition, because we are so much in a hurry and we have to scale up so much in the 2020s, you will also need strong demand measures like mandated quotas. Thank you very much, Edmund.
Thank you, Noé. Now, thank you for your abiding by the discipline, time discipline. We have maybe 1 or 2 minutes for one question. Is there someone who wants to raise a question to the participant, to the panelists? Nina, you don't have any question?
No.
It's okay, then we can go ahead. So
Please.
let us focus now on the price of carbon as an incentive towards net zero. Victor, can you tell us why the IMF is publicly promoting a carbon price floor? Victor, again, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Edmond. And now that I have a little longer, let me start by thanking you for your leadership in what concerns carbon pricing and for organizing events like this one, which I would characterize as a global conversation. And global conversations are crucial to have a cooperative way forward, which is definitely what we should be working towards. There is reason for, I would say, reasonable optimism, because in October it was possible to reach an agreement on international corporate taxation, and that is a global agreement that has some of the characteristics of what we're trying to get for carbon taxation, carbon pricing equivalent measures. And that really shows that it's possible to have a global agreement. It shows how large the payoffs from a global agreement could be. Having a agreement on something like an international carbon price floor is something that I would rate as even more important than the international corporate tax agreement. Now, you ask, and that is crucially important, about how to use the revenues. Carbon pricing creates incentives on the use of energy, the energy productive mix, the adaptation of technology and technological innovation. We're using the price mechanism to provide incentives for a huge transition. It's very hard to imagine that we can do that without using, to a very large extent, the market mechanism. But the revenues are also very important in the context of financing sustainable development. The energy transition has to be, in particular for the developing world, a part of the development strategy. And if we map the energy transition to the sustainable development goals, we see how important these links are. And some days ago, Edmond, you hosted a colleague of mine, James Rofe, that presented those results in detail. When it comes to looking at specific countries, what we see is that the way these revenues should be used varies quite significantly. It depends on the development priorities of the country. It depends on the tax mix of the country. It depends on where the distortions are most pressing. And we have, in several issues of the fiscal monitor, looked at different mixes of carbon pricing and tax cuts, carbon pricing and transfers. And there one needs to have a very careful representation of the country concerned. And that's why having a global agreement and national policies that support it is crucial, and global and national have to work hand in hand.
Thank you very much, Victor. Now, Graciela Shishilniski, through your activities as an environmental scientist and the founder of Global Thermostat, could you give us your arguments about the necessity to start removing carbon from the atmosphere and explain what could be the role of the carbon removal markets, the so-called carbon removal markets? Graciela, you have the floor.
When I wrote the carbon market into the Kyoto Protocol many years ago, the time was ripe to reduce emissions, and that's what the market accomplished. And that's the enormous role of the European Union emission trading system that became the concretization of that carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol. But since then, even though the European Union succeeded, the world emissions increased outside of Europe. And it is, you're looking at a difference between 27 nations and 195 nations. So at this point, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and the US Academy of Sciences, everybody knows it doesn't suffice anymore to limit emissions. Now we have to physically remove the legacy carbon that is already in the atmosphere. This is widely accepted by the IPCC and all the scientific bodies. So now the question is, how can you adapt the carbon market so it helps to remove CO2? And that is what I call, I created as the carbon removal market. And I'm trying to explain for example, the European Union, the European Commission, etc., how to replace and enlarge the concept of the carbon market that I created in 1997 into carbon removal market. So instead of having emission limits, which is what we have in the carbon market, now we're going to have carbon removal targets. Whoever goes above that target has a credit. Out of that, and the requirement about how much carbon we have to remove, emerges the price of carbon that is much higher than what we thought before, because it's the price that is needed to remove the carbon that is already in the atmosphere, which is the only thing that is going to stop the catastrophic climate change now. Therefore, working now with the European Commission, technical bodies, and hopefully political bodies too, in order to explain, create international law for the removal of carbon removal markets. That gives you a higher price for carbon, because now you not only limit emissions, but you have to remove which is already there. I hope this is clear, but I can give more explanations about the securities, the financial markets that can be used to accelerate the process of executing the effects of the carbon removal market that are needed to stop climate change.
Thank you, Graciela. Tom, we see through the current gas crisis the social impact of a rise in the cost of energy. The price of carbon is one of its components and will remain as such, at least during the energy transition. So can you say a few words on the socio-economic dimension of carbon pricing? Tom.
Thank you, Edmund. Yes, clearly, our ministers and the ministers who turn up to COP in a couple of weeks are very well aware that whether it's a carbon removal scheme or a carbon pricing scheme, there's a major sensitivity about energy prices around the world for every actor you can imagine, for households and their ability to either drive their cars or to heat their homes, for businesses who are sensitive to their profit lines, to industry who are needing to adapt and make major investments, and yet they're exposed to international competition, the investors who are meant to be financing these things, and then whole countries, for instance, with major fossil fuel resources, are also going to be impacted by a kind of decarbonisation regime and a carbon pricing regime. So there's different dimensions that have to be picked up. But the good news for all the ministers going to COP is that every example that exists of a carbon price, a carbon tax, or an ETS scheme today has dealt with these issues. There are a range of different measures one can take to identify the nature of the disadvantage or the negative impact or the distributional consequence which needs to be addressed. And there are a range of measures to address it. These might be free allowances within an ETS scheme, compensation or exemptions for taxation regimes, subsidy regimes for poorer households. So yes, we really must identify the distributional impacts and ensure that the overall transition is a just and a fair transition and people-centered. But there are a range of different instruments and policy measures we can use to tackle that.
Thank you, Tom. But the first thing that the people have to understand and accept is that what Lord Turner said at the beginning, the energy transition will have a cost. It will have a cost. And we have to be very well aware of that. Now, Zhang Jingyu, as the executive director of a major Chinese research institute on grid development, can you give us your reaction on the importance of the launch of a national market for carbon in your country, China?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. It works this time. Sorry, apologize for not being able to fully communicable last time. Well, I want to highlight 3 points. I think well, everybody knows that China launched the largest carbon market on July the 16th this year. And the view certainly is quite, different. Some people think it's great. Some people look at the thinking that it's too conservative and has not done what it's supposed to do, given the urgency of the issue. But I want to highlight, 3 perspectives for this audience to consider. The first one is, the launch of the carbon market is a long-term effort. It took exactly 10 years since the issuance of the first carbon trading pilot notice. From then, the leading office of the climate issue, NDRC. And I think it has really demonstrated the government's seriousness on carbon management, put pressure on those emitters, and also give encouragement to the actors. And for those of you who may not know, this is the only nationwide platform of the trading of the environmental commodities in China, and the only flexible mechanisms that is remaining, to give the room, imagination for what's going to happen, what can happen next. I'm not going to go into all the deliberations on signal the pricing, so on and so forth. Certainly all those things apply. Second, I think internationally is really a great testimonial to China's commitment. China's government made this commitment back to 2015, right before the Paris, that China will launch a carbon market. They start the official work on December the 19th, 2017. People have been concerned that because of the up and downs, because of the pandemic, whether the carbon market will be launched. It was launched on July the 16th. And I think it gives people the confidence that Chinese government can deliver and will deliver whatever it promised, no matter what, under what different kind of circumstance. And I think the third is really the room of imagination. We all have heard President Xi's groundbreaking announcement again on September the 22nd, following his earlier, 1 year earlier commitment announcement of China's peaking and carbon neutrality goals. And this time he said China will stop financing overseas coals, and also of this green BRI initiative that I can share, what I can share with you is that's what my institute is doing, is really trying to convey, to transfer China's experience in building the carbon market to the other countries through different forms. And I think that momentum is going to be very precious and should be further encouraged. Over back to you.
Thank you, Jian Yu. Now, coming to Europe, France launching from the Central Bank of Austria, a few words on the implementation of carbon pricing in your country, Austria. Please.
Thank you very much. In Austria, our government has just decided to introduce by mid next year a carbon price of 30 euro per ton. This carbon price will in steps increase to 55 euros by 2025. The income from this carbon pricing will be redistributed to the population. You will receive 100 euro if you live in an area where there is good public transport, and 200 euros per person if you live in an area where there is bad public transport. The problem being with this redistribution of the income is it does give the wrong incentives, because the communities have an incentive not to have better public transport, because when you get a lower subsidy. Better would have been to give everybody the same and say 100 euro and save the rest for increasing public transport. Thank you.
Thank you, France. And we should not forget, by the way, that Austria belongs to the ETS, European ETS.
Yeah.
So the energy sector, for example, there is the price of carbon of about 60 euro per ton.
60 euros, yeah.
Okay, now it's urgent now to raise the same question from Brazil. Joachim Levy, with your dual expertise from the market and as a former finance minister of your country, Brazil, a brief comment. Joachim.
Well, so in most countries, of course, fossil fuels taxes have long acted as carbon prices in transportation. And in several occasions, they help support ethanol as a fuel for alternative fuel for light vehicles. For instance, when global oil prices were depressed. More recently, a formal market was created about biofuels with a lot of rigors in measuring the footprint of the biofuels and direct payments for the producers. More recently, Congress has started to discuss a regulated market, carbon market focused mainly on large industry and energy suppliers. This framework, developed together with the World Bank, envisages, of course, border adjustments taxes, but also that up to 20% of emissions could be offset with carbon credits, mostly from the agriculture and forest sectors. Now, we believe this structure will be quite efficient with carbon prices high enough to stimulate substantial investment in new technologies, in industry, for instance, but not choking the industry, and especially helping finance low carbon agriculture and forest protections, which, by the way, are excellent mechanisms for carbon removal, and also delivering on social and biodiversity goals. So we look forward to its implementation in the next administration, which will be elected in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Felicia Wu, on carbon pricing in the US now. It is facing opposition from the Republicans, but Hans Paulson, a Republican, not only created the Paulson Institute, for which you work, but is pledging as well for a federal carbon tax. So is there any chance for your country to adopt some kind of carbon pricing at the national level anytime soon? Please, Felicia, a short reaction.
Thank you, Edmund, for your question and this opportunity to share a few thoughts. Establishing a national level policy for carbon is indeed critical and a bold step that our country needs to take, and countries globally need to be taking to limit carbon. There's momentum, as Tom mentioned earlier, with various supranational, subnational jurisdictions that have carbon pricing schemes in force or in development. And in the US, we have strong regional carbon markets in California and in New England. And though while subnational, these markets have been useful in discouraging firms from releasing carbon into the atmosphere and encouraging them to develop, invest in, and scale clean, low carbon technologies. This aligns with some of Victor's comments earlier. But that said, it is going to be difficult in the short term for the US to have any level of national carbon pricing. Whether it's the carbon tax like our chairman has called for, or national carbon markets, it's very likely all forms of carbon pricing will remain a political hot potato. But as the world is increasingly developing and implementing carbon pricing, such as China's national carbon market that came online this summer, it is only a matter of time until carbon credits and debits become currency for climate change. And that said, it's past time that the US work to adopt some form of national carbon pricing. But to quickly close, I think, as other speakers have already mentioned, carbon pricing is not a cure-all. There needs to be a host of other policies, including regulation, subsidies, R&D investment, targeted incentives that, together with carbon pricing, have a combined effect to meaningfully address the climate challenge. So I think my time is coming up. So let me stop here, and thank you, Edmund, again for the question.
Thank you. Now, just a word on the implementation of carbon pricing in industrial sectors. And let us take the case of cement. There was already a comment from the oil and gas industry by Gabriel. But Jan Riley, as the CEO of the World Cement Association, do you think that giving a price to carbon could be a good incentive to reduce carbon emission?
Thank you, Edmund. There are two key drivers for decarbonizing cement. One is the market, and of course, the governments can play a big role in that because public procurement of cement represents a significant portion of the market. And then the other is carbon pricing. And I think Christian Gollier was right earlier in saying it helps to align the public and the private incentives. So it's a bit like putting your foot on the accelerator. We'll have some decarbonization at $10 a ton. At the current pricing in Europe, at say 60 euros a ton, we're going to go pretty fast. And if it goes higher, we'll go faster still. I did want to just say one thing though about the ETS. The ETS, when it comes to cement, doesn't work in a very straightforward fashion. And the free allocation and the border adjustment mechanism and the way in which the free allocation is given related to clinker volumes mean that some types of decarbonization are not credited by the ETS. So I think it's a little bit more complicated picture than just looking at the headline price. Thank you, Edmund.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We will work again with you and other and see what can be done, because your answer is very encouraging. Now, turning to the subject, which is very important and topical, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Benjamin Angel, you are the director at the European Commission in charge of it for the European Union, CBAM. CBAM, a protectionist measure, an incentive towards sectorial level playing fields. And what about the so-called implicit price of carbon? Benjamin.
Thank you, Edmund, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, rather. Definitely not a protectionist measure. We have established CBAM primarily for two purposes. The first one is to reduce the risk of carbon leakage and would cancel our effort. And the second one is to incentivize third country to introduce legislation with some carbon pricing and third country producer to reduce their carbon footprint when they're trading with us. The way it works is quite simple. We equalize the carbon price paid on our ETS, and we take as a basis the real situation. So whatever free allowance we have on our domestic market is automatically discounted from the CBAM charge. So if we have 50% of free allowance, for instance, we charge only 50% of the CBAM. It's a climate tool. It's not a trade instrument. It's not a protectionist instrument. The best evidence is that we deduct 100% of the carbon price paid abroad. So any country having an ETS or a carbon tax with a comparable level of pricing than the one we have on our market, will have its producer not subject to a payment under CBAM. But the way it works, we need an explicit carbon pricing. And that you were right to ask, Edmund, because this is an important component. We don't care whether this carbon price is a tax or a market price, but we are relatively skeptical with the idea of using an implicit price. I think it would add a lot of complexity to our system with no clear benefit. Those who advocate for an implicit carbon price say that they have regulation which are technically equivalent to pushing the cost on the industry, but they forget that we also in the European Union have a very stringent regulatory framework, and that with Fit for 55, we're working on making this regulatory framework even more stringent. So if we were to follow this avenue, it means that we would have to turn our CBAM in a particularly complex instrument, whereby we should use as a reference our explicit carbon price, add to this explicit carbon price the implicit carbon price that comes from our regulation, and then deduct from the addition of both any implicit carbon price paid abroad because of regulation. It's very complex, and we don't really need it because the CBAM, as constructed, is based on real emission. So if countries introduce regulation to reduce the carbon footprint, and if the regulation work, it is automatically captured in CBAM. So we don't see the benefit of this extra complexity, not to mention that there is a fundamental difference between an explicit carbon price and an implicit carbon price. An explicit carbon price is an observable variable. It's not something someone can dispute. You see what is the price on the market, you see what is the tax paid. An implicit carbon price is among the topic for which economists can easily discuss during 10 years. So we would plead for keeping simplicity. We start step by step. So we plan to have a dry run between 2023 and 2026, where we collect data, but we don't charge anything. And then a phasing in over 10 years between 26 and 2036, which corresponds to the phasing out of free allowances domestically on our market. I think we are clearly in the forefront of a very important debate on carbon pricing, because this is the first time that an instrument is put on the table that is not only inward looking, but both inward and external looking, and pushing also the others to consider carbon pricing. It's interesting that this debate is really picking up. There are now discussions in the G7, in the G20. There is a very good paper which has been done by the IMF. And it is even more interesting to see that things are moving on the other side of the Atlantic. As you certainly know, there is a draft legislation which is in discussion in Congress on creating the border. It's been tabled by Senator Coons and Representative Petters. And there are also discussion on whether to have a carbon tax in the US. We know also that some partners like Canada have mentioned very clearly their intention to go for a CBAM. So I think what we're witnessing is the start of a true global discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angel. Very, very important what you are saying. On implicit price, fair competition. If you take, for example, the steel sector, fair competition needs an explicit price. With an implicit price, you cannot have fair competition, and there carbon leakage will go on. So thank you very much for your observations, Angel. Now, a reaction from the president of Shandong University, Zhongzhu. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Well, actually, it is still too early to evaluate the impact of CBAM. But in short term, I see the weak links between China and EU in CBAM, because well, the CBAM on Chinese economy wouldn't be very big because number one, only less than 2% of the China export to the EU is covered by the CBAM. And second, well, China, when the CBAM is completely implemented, China has already reached its emission peak and decreased carbon emission for 60 years.
Is it finished? Yeah. Nina?
No, I think there's an issue with the Wi-Fi.
Shall we go on?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
please do.
Okay.
You are still with us? You are still with us?
Mm-hmm.
Please go on.
Yes.
Please go on.
Yeah. Well, but in long run, well, the CBAM may have big impact on China export. The first, well, the future with the CBAM would be cover more and more all of the sectors, and also, well, CBAM will consider indirect emission from the whole value chains. Well, China will face higher cost, the carbon cost, and also with the adjustment cost for the global value chain restructuring. And well, from Chinese side, China will extend, well, the sectors in China ETS from electricity to other 7 sectors, including the chemicals, the steel, metals, construction materials, paper, civil aviation, etc., and even more sectors. And well, China will also expand the market investors from the producers, the emissioners, to the financial investors and even the speculators. So, well, the price gap will narrow, and I can see the convergence trend. Well, the technology cooperation between China and the EU, and even, well, the linkage between these two, the markets. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Gabriel Gauthier, your view from a business firm.
Well, it's true that the rise on the carbon price and the reduction of free allocations are about to deteriorate the competitiveness of a lot of sectors in the industrial, in the European industry. Although for the moment we're not in it because refineries are not included. We understand and we are considering the interest for us, but we also have discussions with our customers or partners of the steel industry. Globally, we welcome something that is viewed as necessary to set up a level playing field internationally. So CBAM is definitely for us a good tool. Although there are, of course, still questions. Not only the WTO compatibility, but also the export. How do you deal with the exports of products to grant the competitiveness of the European industry in its export? How do you just cover Scope 1 and not Scope 2? That is the indirect emissions from the energy that you consume. And the other question is, some people, how long is the transition phase? The 10 years is looked at as, of course, far too long for some countries and from NGOs, and a good time period for some industry. So there's still some details to be fixed, but we definitely need a level playing field.
Thank you, Gabriel. Guido Whittaker, you are working at the German think tank Agora Energiewende. A brief comment on industrial sectors and CBAM from your view.
Yes, thank you, Edmund. So, in our view, the CBAM can be understood as an enabling measure for the industrial transition in Europe. Because without a CBAM, there is no cost increase to the conventional high carbon industrial products, so the things that we're talking about at the moment. And this makes it harder for kilo carbon technologies to come to the market, or for recyclers to have demand for high quality recycled materials. This is really important. Without a CBAM, it would also raise the cost of subsidizing low carbon technologies to unrealistically high levels. The second point I want to make is that the EU is well aware that the CBAM will have impacts on trade partners, but it has also made every effort to ensure that CBAM is A, non-discriminatory to foreign products, and B, is phased in gradually to allow time for adjustment and development of accounting and verification system, and to also implement the decarbonized technologies in third countries. The last point I want to make is that CBAM can also be seen as an opportunity and not a threat, because for companies around the world that can produce low carbon steel, aluminum, cement, or fertilizers, this is a major opportunity because it heralds the creation of markets that will reward and that will pay the premium for low carbon commodities. And we do see that there's a lot of regions around the world where there are cheap and abundant renewables. So we believe the shift is inevitable, and the CBAM is simply the first step towards it. This is the change necessary as part of the transition to a global market for decarbonized global basic material commodities.
Thank you very much, Vido. Now, Jakob von Weizsäcker, you are the Chief Economist of German Federal Ministry of Finance. A brief German complementary comment to what has been said. Please, Jakob, the floor is yours.
Edmond, many thanks for putting the workshop together. It's wonderful. Of course, given the different carbon prices around the world, we are going to require some sort of border adjustment, because simply giving away a CO2 certificate for free is not an option. And I think what the Commission has put forward with that is a very useful way to look at this problem. If there seems to be some background noise. Somebody has left their microphone on, I believe. So we think it's a very useful proposal, but of course there are two real challenges. The first challenge has to do with resource shuffling. Just imagine you import a ton of aluminium and from a company that has green electricity and not so green electricity. They're always sending the aluminium to Europe, going to say, well, this ton is done with very green electricity. And the other problem, and it was alluded to, of course, already by Gabriel, is that on the export leakage and export competitiveness side, of course, CBAM itself does not offer an answer. So given the complexities of actually making a border adjustment that we will require, given different carbon prices around the world, work, and given some of the trade tensions that are already there and ideally shouldn't be exacerbated, we believe it would be extremely helpful against the backdrop of the necessity of carbon border adjustment and against the backdrop of the complexities I just alluded to really try and aim for a carbon club. And this is, of course, what Olaf Scholz, my minister, and possibly the next German chancellor is really launching in the debate. And I think the way to look at CBAM is that it's an excellent complement to this much wider discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. Martin, your turn to briefly give your own takeaways from these exchanges on CBAM. Please, Martin, you have the floor.
I'd like just to bring together the previous discussions of this one, because I think it leads us to a very clear place. I think it would be agreed on the model of the corporation tax agreement, minimum corporation tax agreement, that it is even more important, I would say several orders of magnitude more important, to have an agreement on carbon pricing. At the moment, this is impossible. That makes it very difficult for any individual group of countries or country to move. And if they do, as the EU is to its great credit planning to do, it has to introduce an adjustment mechanism, as Jakob von Weizsäcker said. So that logically follows. Of course, it's a very messy, complex, and imperfect thing to do, but we're in the land of the second or third best. We have to do it. The ideal outcome of a CBAM is exactly as he suggests and others have suggested, which is to reach a global agreement with the principal players, as we did with the corporation tax, on a global minimum price. And I think, as I suggested earlier, this looks to me the most plausible and effective way of getting there. And I commend the EU for taking this necessary step.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you. Thank you for all the speakers, because you abide by the discipline. It's great, great. Now we turn to the so-called global sectoral approach to decarbonization, and the floor is naturally to Ada Turner. Ada, you have the floor.
Thank you. My comments will build on these ones about the CBAM. I want to start by making clear we don't need a universal carbon price in all sectors. The biggest challenge in the UK's path to net zero is actually going to be decarbonising our residential heat. It would be useful if we had a carbon price applying to the residential use of gas for domestic boiler heating, but it's not essential. We can drive residential heat decarbonisation by other mechanisms, by a date beyond which it's illegal to put in gas boilers, and by subsidies for heat pump installation. And we certainly do not need a gas price in a tax on residential gas in the UK, which is exactly the same as one in China or the US. We don't need that. As for road transport and the Gilets jaunes, it's important to note that European excise taxes on diesel and gasoline are already quite high implicit carbon prices, and that again, in road transport, we have other mechanisms to progress road transport decarbonisation, such as bans beyond which one cannot buy an internal combustion engine. The UK has set that for 2030. And indeed, I think with road transport electrification, by the late 2020s, you will have electric vehicles which are cheaper to buy up front, as well as cheaper to run than internal combustion engines. So it will occur even without an addition to the high carbon prices. So I have to say that in that respect, I'm a little bit wary of proposals coming out of the European Commission that we have to expand carbon prices to all sectors of the economy. But there are some sectors where carbon prices are hugely important. They are the hard to abate sectors. In these sectors, they are both essential and incredibly powerful for two reasons. They are incredibly important in steel, cement, chemicals, shipping, aviation, because in these sectors, unlike with road transport, it is unlikely that the new technologies will ever actually be cheaper than the old technologies. There will probably always be some green cost premium to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors. So we need a carbon price that bridges the gap between the cost of producing steel in a carbon intensive fashion and in a zero carbon fashion. And in these sectors also, carbon prices are hugely important, are hugely effective. And they're hugely effective because in these sectors, you have professional managers of cost, and energy cost is a huge part of their input. So you have sectors which will respond very quickly to the price signal in a way which is not true of the ordinary household who doesn't sit down of an evening with an Excel spreadsheet and work out the net present value of alternative future technologies for heating their houses, whereas steel mills and cement plants do. So these are the sectors where carbon prices are hugely important. And I referred earlier to the Net Zero Steel Initiative report, which came out last week, supported by ArcelorMittal, ThyssenKrupp, SSAB, Severstal from Russia, Tata from Europe and India. And in that report, they said that if you simply applied a technology moratorium, as it was called, in which each new technology investment would be zero carbon, you'd get to net zero by 2050, but you might only reduce emissions by 10 to 15% by 2030. But that if there was a carbon price of not huge, just $70 a ton, with real bite across the world, one could get 35% reductions by 2020. and by 2030, which means that we should aim for multi-country agreements on carbon prices as much as possible, but that we don't need it in every sector of the economy. And it also means that if we can't get those global agreements, we should apply CBAMs. As Benjamin Angel has already said, CBAMs are not protectionist. They are not aiming to cut out imports, and they are not aiming to raise revenue. Indeed, the principle is very clear that the European Union is applying, that it doesn't want to have to take this money. It would much rather that India or Turkey or Russia or China were imposing a carbon price and getting the tax revenue themselves. It's quite interesting to have a country saying, a jurisdiction saying, we're going to raise a tax, but what we really wanted to do is to make sure that you receive it, not us. But that is what is going on. If effective, it should create a strong incentive for other countries to do the same. Is that incentive working? Well, Benjamin Angel and I were on a panel discussion with a Chinese policy expert the other day, who reported to us that the head of Baowu Steel, the biggest Chinese and the biggest global steel producer, had publicly said that the European CBAM would force Chinese steel producers to decarbonize faster in order to reduce the way of having to pay that payment into Europe. And he didn't say that as a bad thing. He said that as a good thing. That is the incentive working. So yes, we should go and drive for as much cross-sectoral, cross-global agreement in these major sectors of the economy. But if not, I think we should use the CBAM as an incentive, which I think is turning out to be an effective one.
Thank you very much, Adair. Tom, a point of view from the International Energy Agency on this approach, please.
I would say we are rather aligned with Adair Turner. I think it's Adair has flagged up very well the fact that there are so many different circumstances across different sectors, across different countries, across different technologies, and for each such circumstance, we have to work out what is the appropriate instrument, what different instrument, whether it's a subsidy or a price incentive or a regulatory measure or a phasing out of pollution technology. What's the most effective going to work in those circumstances? And where a price signal is going to be effective, whether it's the manager who's got the spreadsheet in front of them, as opposed to the household without it. If that manager is able to see the price signal and also able to respond to it, if there are effective alternatives where he can actually make that change, then that's a good example of where we could introduce a carbon price. So we have to go through step by step each example to see whether this is where a carbon pricing regime can work or whether another policy is more appropriate. But overall, it's in the commercial world where we've got large-scale players who are responsive to prices and also where they have real alternatives. The electricity sector is the best example, because there we know there are multiple alternatives available to electricity suppliers to switch, whether it's fuel switching or technology switching. So that's the easiest example, but one has to go through that kind of logic in every sector to see what's most appropriate.
Thank you, Tom. Angel, a brief reaction to Tom and Adair. Angel.
Benjamin, actually.
Benjamin, excuse me, Benjamin.
I certainly agree with almost everything that Adair has said. We think that price signals are essential, and it's important to force everyone to internalize the negative externality which are attached to carbon. Now, what is the best tool? Our view is that in most cases, not all, in most cases, having an effective carbon price via a system of ETS or carbon tax is the best one. That said, I agree with Tom that it's not the only instrument. Other instruments can also be used in some cases. What we have tried to do with CBAM is to focus for the start on 5 sectors and 5 sectors only, which are cement, aluminium, iron and steel, fertilizer, and electricity. We have not picked them randomly. we have picked them because those 5 represent more than half of our emissions. And therefore, by focusing on a limited number of sectors, we can already try to test on a wide scale an instrument that can help achieving further results, and that could be possibly extended to other sectors in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. Let us come back to steel and a reaction on what others said. First from Guido. Guido, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So I very much share the point of view from Ade Turner that the action in the 2020s is of crucial importance. There is a fundamental misconception that the steel sector transformation will only truly pick up pace after 2030. And I think this is because it was initially labeled as a hard to abate sector, which I think is not true anymore. And this misconception, in my view, comes because of a lack of understanding of 2 key aspects. The first one is the reinvestment cycles. More than 2/3 of the global coal-based blast furnace capacity will reach their end of life before 2030 and require reinvestment. So this puts the global steel sector at a crossroads where they have to decide for each of the blast furnaces, do I invest into a conventional technology with the risk of a long-term carbon lock-in and potentially stranded assets in the future? Or do I invest into the new technology? The second aspect that most people do not understand, in my opinion, is that the kilo carbon technologies in the steel sector are already there and can be deployed now. Many people think about hydrogen-based direct reduction. Many people like to look into the projects in Sweden, and they still see that this cannot be built now. But the reality is that we do already have announcements in Europe where companies say they want to build commercial scale DRI plants by 2025, which means they will need to take a final investment decision next year. Now, what do? Will they have enough hydrogen? Probably in 2025, they won't have enough clean hydrogen. But what they will do is that they run these plants on natural gas. This will slash the emissions by 2/3. And then without any retrofit, they can phase in the clean hydrogen over time as it becomes available. This is an extremely crucial part of any global steel transformation narrative, because we have those 2 pieces in place now. We know the reinvestment cycles, and we know that the key technologies are ready. Now, the big question is still policy action, because nothing of this will happen on its own. Policy action is crucial and is needed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Guido. Before giving the floor to Franco Bernabé, instead of leaving the receipts Adair to the government, I wonder whether, in order to accelerate the speed of retrofitting the steel industry, don't you think that we could use part of the receipts of this carbon pricing?
Well, look, there's always this issue of what you use the receipts for. I think it's secondary to the price incentive that it is creating. And I think there are interesting 3 possible ways that you could think it would be a good way to direct it. One would be to say, this gives us some extra revenue that we should also put into more direct forms of technology support, technology support for not an ongoing subsidy, but the very first pilot plants of, for instance, hydrogen direct reduction or whatever the relevant technologies are. So that is one potential use of it. Another potential use, and we heard from Austria, is the, as it were, winning the political argument approach, which is the citizens' dividend approach, which says, here, this is coming back to the citizens as a benefit. I would throw in one other issue specifically, not carbon prices in general, but CBAM in particular. I think it's very, very important that we win this global argument that this is not protectionist, that this is nothing to do with trying to protect European steel industry against fair competition from overseas. It is absolutely not to the disadvantage of developing countries. One twist one might think about to help win that argument would be to declare that we're going to take all the revenues from the CBAM and recycle them as climate finance to support decarbonisation efforts in any developing countries which are willing to put together really serious decarbonisation plans, including in these once hard to abate, though I agree with Guido, that we're now realizing that some of them are less hard to abate than we used to think.
Thank you. Franco, reaction from the steel industry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edmond. On CBAM and the global international agreement, let me put this in the right framework. Industrial emissions account for 40% of the total CO2 emissions, and the hard-to-abate sectors, steel, cement, and chemicals, account for 70% of all industrial emissions. And 30% of all emissions are concentrated in these three sectors. So China alone accounts for 50% of the total production of these three sectors. So that means that instead of looking for a global international agreement that is really, I think, impossible to achieve, what is important to have is an agreement with China and some countries in the Asia-Pacific region that are the largest producers in the hard-to-abate sector. Second point, and I strongly support what Edmond said in the last comment he made, because the reasons why these sectors are included in the hard-to-abate category is that CO2 is an essential component of the chemical process that is used for the production of these products, and high temperatures that are needed in the process can be achieved only through combustion. These are sectors that have low margin, are highly cyclical, and have a high capital intensity. So I don't share all this optimism about the fact that these sectors will pick up in a very quick way all the finance needed for the transition to a CO2-free economy. I think that it needs support, and I think that the right way to proceed is what Edmond said. They need definitely support. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Domenico, some takeaways, brief takeaways from this discussion. Domenico?
Yeah, here I am. I was mute.
You're welcome.
Well, in the energy intensive industries, the game is to reduce emissions by moving technology rather than by repressing production by higher prices. So the idea is to promote tech change without killing production in the short run. I buy the idea set forth by other of and the panel he was referring to, of a moderate or not too high carbon pricing, provided we can ensure its stability. Because if this price becomes volatile, then we pay the cost without having the desired result. In that respect, I believe, listening to this discussion, that the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, may be very important, not only to reduce emission, but also to facilitate international cooperation. So I believe these three instruments should be working together.
Thank you, Domenico. Thank you. Now it's time to start some development on CCS and removing gaseous emissions. So let us further explore this question, which is very important, by a presentation by Sylvie Corneau-Gandolf. In your work for the French think tank IFRI, you give very topical insights about the use of CCS and CCUS for coal-fired plants in the first place. Sylvie, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, No, for giving me the opportunity to address this very important and timely meeting on CCS and its use in the coal power plant. Decarbonizing the power sector is crucial to reaching net zero emission. Obviously, the acceleration of electrification of end use means that it is very important to reach net zero emissions. Today, the sector is responsible for 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions, and 2/3 of these emissions come from coal combustion in power plants. That means that coal is on the top of the agenda of the decarbonization policies. Beyond the acceleration of renewables and low carbon energy sources, there is a global trend towards phasing out coal, as was mentioned by Adair in his intervention. This is, of course, a very radical solution to drastically and rapidly reduce CO2 emission from power generation. But still, 35% of global electricity is produced from coal, and in the Asian region, it's even 60% and even 70%, for instance, in India. So that means that a transition will need to be managed in order to get away from coal. This applies in particular to China, where the majority of the coal fleet is constituted by large, high-efficient units built during the past decade. Retrofitting these power plants with CCS will be required, both to ensure the reliability and security of the electricity system, to avoid the anticipated retirement of the coal fleet, which is very young, as I mentioned, and to ensure security of supply. The good news today is that there is growing interest across the world in CCS, also in the coal power sector. There are a growing number of demonstration projects, especially in China, where large power utilities have started, have announced plans to capture CO2 on coal power plants at industrial scale. There are new business models which are emerging, such as hub and cluster approach, which will reduce cost of CCS by allowing economies of scale. There is also growing, increasing cooperation between governments and the private sector at both national and international level to fund CCS projects and to encourage the permanent safe storage of CO2 emissions. For instance, I am thinking about the Quick Starter initiative led by the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. On the other hand, CCS technologies have still several economic, technical, and regulatory challenges to overcome. The cost of CCS remains very high today because there are still limited number of demonstration CCS projects. And that means that it's required both increased research and innovation to decrease the cost of CCS. And above all, it requires a strong incentive and support from governments. Carbon pricing in this way will be a very important instrument to drive investment by governments and the private sector in CCS project and in decarbonization in general. Carbon pricing gives the right price signal to power utilities to start investing in CCS projects. For instance, in Norway, the two initial CCS projects that were developed in Europe were driven by a carbon tax. And we see today in Europe that there are many, but there are several new projects that are established based on the rising price of CO2. In addition to phasing out carbon emissions, carbon pricing has the additional advantage of providing a significant financial resources to speed up the decarbonization and to fund these projects. One good example, for instance, is the European Innovation Fund, based on the proceeds on the EU ETS, which has committed at least 20 billion euros for low carbon technologies, including CCS. So it's a very good way to speed up the decarbonizations. Finally, I would like, of course, to mention China, which is really a key actor as far as coal and CCS are concerned. I think that the recent introduction of carbon market is an excellent news, and it offers a very crucial opportunity for funding a large-scale deployment of CCS in China in the coal power sector. Synergies can be developed with other sectors, such as the production of low-carbon hydrogen, green cement, as we just mentioned, or green steel, in decarbonized CCS clusters that will share CCS storage and infrastructure. This would help optimize the cost of decarbonization and speed up the achievement of the carbon peak target. This would also give a very strong signal to the rest of the world on how China can drive an efficient decarbonization pathway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvie. Adair, your own appraisal about this technique, CCS, CCUS technique.
On CCS, I think one has to again distinguish different areas where it could be applied. In some sectors, I anticipate considerably less use of CCS than I expected 10 years ago. I used to think that the predominant way to decarbonize steel would be to continue to use coking coal and to apply CCS to blast furnaces. But the latest report actually suggests that the demand for coking coal could go down 85 or 90% by 2050, and that different technologies, including hydrogen technologies, which don't require CCS, and some CCS on gas technologies, are far likely to play a major role, but less role for CCS there. On the other hand, there are some sectors where we know CCS will be vital. I really don't know any way to get to zero carbon cement without having CCS. But I want to comment particularly on the power sector. I think we are now in this situation, unlike 10 years ago, where renewables on a like-for-like new plant basis will easily beat coal plus CCS. So I don't see any role for building new coal plants and saying, I'm going to add CCS to those new coal plants. But we have this major challenge of existing coal plants. And while renewables are now cheaper, I think, than the full cost of building an existing coal plant, they are often not cheaper when you have to build them anew to beat the marginal cost of existing coal plants. And we do have a huge challenge across the world of whether we can accelerate the decarbonization in some way of existing coal plants. We will have to achieve that. If we don't achieve that, if we simply allow all existing coal plants to run without CCS to the end of their useful life, we essentially have no chance of limiting to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We need a strategy for existing coal. That can be to actually close them down before end of useful life. It can be to get them to run a much smaller number of hours per year, transitioning to play a backup system to renewables, and it can be adding CCS. But the crucial thing to realize is every one of those will require a financial flow to support. Unlike some other areas of decarbonization, this is not something that will happen without a subsidy flow. And so we need to think about where that flow is going to come from, either within domestic carbon markets or through international climate finance, with the developed rich world helping the developing world achieve an accelerated exit from the existing coal plants that already exist.
Thank you, Adair. Now a reaction from Mr. Gao Lin. You work at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. We all know, and it has been repeated by Sylvie, that China is looking carefully at CCS. It has put a national market for carbon. And so the question raised by Adair and by Sophie, would it make sense to use the resources of this national market for carbon market to fund the retrofitting of coal-fired plants, existing coal-fired plants with CCS? Please. Lynn.
Thanks very much, Edmund. I totally agree with Sylvia and Adair's point. I want to emphasize that firstly, after announcement of the carbon neutral target of 2060, the CCS problem is becoming to be or not to be for fossil fuel industries, because without CCS, all the fossil fuel plants will be closed or replaced by the renewable energy before 2060. So, however, considering the capacity and the resources characteristics of China, and also the concern about the energy supply security, and the fossil fuel, is really hard. It's really difficult to imagine an energy mix that totally phase out the fossil fuel for China. And to the present, the power industry and oil industry had already working together to promote the large-scale demonstration, like 1 million ton project of Huaneng in Shanxi province. To present, there are 2 to 3 large-scale projects is in implement. And in the following 20 years, most of the existing power plants will face the challenge of decarbonization. And more than 70% of these power plants were installed in the last 20 years. That means that their operation life still have 20 years. So we can say that the retrofitting market is very broad in China. However, I'm a little worried about the carbon market, the function of carbon market of China, or how to say the future of the carbon market, because to the present, the carbon market of China is how to say, it haven't been connected to the other market, or how to say, it is isolated. For example, if we could not transfer the cost of decarbonization to the energy consumer through the energy market, and it will difficult for the carbon market to grow, you know, because for power plants, yes, it emits CO2, but it does not consume their products. It does not consume the electricity. It should not we just punish the power plants because they emit CO2. So this cost will be taken by all the energy consumers. But if we have not built the mature energy market, it will be difficult to get the excellent progress of the carbon market alone. So how to say, the pricing matter of the moment is the supporting the large-scale demonstration project, because the early successful large-scale projects will be the first step. To the present, according to my knowledge, the financing for the final project is really difficult. If we can find some business model, national or international, to support the early opportunities to promise they're successful, and we will have the future for CCS in China. And this will be the first step. And after this, I think maybe how to say that tomorrow is another day. We can see the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lin, for this contribution. Now our conversation will focus on methane, a major greenhouse gas, which, thanks God, start being now in the spotlight. Dan McDougall, through your work for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, please give us your own insights. Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Edmund. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for organizing this magnificent discussion today. I'm going to start off where Mr. Fabius started, and that's looking at Glasgow in particular and what we can expect, hopefully, from Glasgow. And from a methane perspective, what we're expecting to come to the fore in Glasgow is a much more significant recognition of the importance of methane to the overall climate discussion. And this is moving up to the level of leader level discussions for countries, and that's both welcome and necessary. And I'll tell you why, because of the importance of methane. Methane is already driving over half of the warming that we're experiencing to date, even though it's only a small percentage of the emissions. It's a very, very powerful warmer, over 100 times more powerful than CO2. And it also has the potential to significantly reduce the temperature that we're expecting to see. Because it exists only a short time in the atmosphere, unlike CO2, which exists for thousands of years, it's only about 10 years in the atmosphere. So if we get rid of the methane going into the atmosphere, we will have a very near-term impact on temperature increases. We can avoid up to 0.3 of a degree of temperature impact in the 2040s by taking action now. So that's kind of what we're expecting and hoping to see out of Glasgow, much more significant focus on methane. The other important aspect that's touched on this sectoral approach, there's only a few sectors where methane actually exists. The agriculture sector, the waste sector, coal and coal bed methane, and oil and gas. So 4 sectors responsible for all of the methane. That's important as we turn to what happens coming out of Glasgow. And what happens coming out of Glasgow is we actually have to be poised and ready to act and to take advantage of these opportunities that are there. And as has been mentioned, to look at the 2020s. So in the 2020s, we can have a very real and very significant reduction of methane. And of those 4 sectors, the one that is perhaps poised the best to immediate action is the oil and gas sector. And I'll tell you why. There's a few reasons. First of all, the technologies already exist. Proven technology, very straightforward, simple to put in place in most cases. Very cost-effective reductions. Over half of the emissions reductions can take place at a negative cost. So you're actually going to conserve a very valuable commodity, and this is useful for the companies themselves. So they just need a little prompt in order to get this to happen. The third reason is that we've got a number of countries who are starting and ready to act. So we've got a very committed coalition of the willing, let us say, who are willing to act immediately to take actions to reduce emissions. And importantly, we're seeing a large number of companies who are also committed, particularly in the oil and gas sector, to this kind of action that's going to be necessary to reduce these emissions. So what we need to be ready for coming out of Glasgow is immediate action and scaling up that action. Let me turn just a second to what that means in practice. So the discussions we've been having on this over the last year suggest that the best approach for the oil and gas sector, as we look at emissions reductions, is kind of a hybrid approach. So it's going to be based fundamentally on a regulatory regime, but that regulatory regime can be a much more modern regulatory regime than the old command and control regimes that we've seen in the past. And countries are already demonstrating that you can build in hybrid mechanisms with price signals and market mechanisms that will significantly enhance the capacity of the regulatory system to prompt action from the emitters. So that's a very important component. But as we get into that more modern hybrid type approach of regulatory systems, it's also going to need very strong measurement, reporting, and verification mechanisms to make sure that that's functioning well and appropriately. And again, on that front, there's good news that's happening with, global coalitions of countries and organizations stepping up on the MRV front, the measurement, reporting, and verification, to put that in place so that it's ready to act. So very important area of work, poised for significant delivery, and we look forward to enhancing that out of Glasgow and being ready to act on all of the sectors. The four that I mentioned have good opportunities for reduction. The one that's perhaps most ready to act is the oil and gas sector.
Thank you, Dan. Matt Colezar, you are working for a major oil and gas company. Give your own point of view, please, on the phasing out of methane. Matt.
Thank you very much. I strongly agree with everything Dan had said. I think ExxonMobil and the oil and gas industry at large believe methane emission mitigation is important, and aggressive strategies are required and worthwhile. Our data suggests, both within our company and the industry, that the methane mitigation is cost effective, particularly when you compare it against other decarbonization strategies. We do see that methane abatement, even for some of our more challenging applications, is well below sort of the next tranche of decarbonization. And so if you look at it individually, you can say, well, that's not very cost effective. But again, when you step back and look at methane abatement at large, we do agree that it warrants action, and the science supports rapid action. And to that end, we do support the global methane pledge that is emerging and may sort of get announced here at the COP. We are largely supportive of that, and I think most of industry would be. I do think it needs to be mindful to cover all sectors, even though oil and gas may have the most cost-effective and technology-ready solutions. And so that hopefully is something good that comes out of the COP. On the MRV standards on reporting and measurement, clearly that is very important, and I think that's a gray area for methane right now, and it's not well understood. I give a lot of credit to IEA and their methane tracker, which came out a few years ago. That's added a lot of transparency and dialogue to better understanding the global footprint. I will say that's still, again, in its infancy, quite honestly, and I would caution folks from jumping to a price on methane. While industry largely does support market mechanisms, I would say the challenges in accurately quantifying methane emissions to a fiscal quality, I don't think are there yet. And not to say it's due to lack of it trying. And again, many of the IOCs are pursuing technology developments to move from research to commercial application to real full transparency of the data globally, utilizing airplanes, drones, satellites, and we'll see a lot more of that in the very near future, and that's all very good, and I think that will support some of these global initiatives with the transparency and democratization of the data. I guess the last thing I'd say is, I'll just reiterate, I do think methane mitigation is very important. I'm highly optimistic that certainly in oil and gas, we can knock this out very quickly once our awareness and the technology evolves a bit. And I think it'll really support the continued use of natural gas and blue hydrogen in the energy mix. And I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Brendan Devlin, you are an advisor to the European Commission. Could you give some brief outlines of the recent EU-US agreement on methane?
Yes, thank you very much. The EU-US Global Methane Pledge is a pledge to reduce methane emissions across all sectors by 30% by 2030. That actually, in practical terms, is actually higher, about 35, 37%, because of statistical reasons. And that is 2/3 of what we need to reach our 1.5 pathway by 2050. So we would still, even with the pledge, have to do other things in the methane area, particularly on lifestyles and other things related to diet. But for oil, gas, coal, waste, and agriculture, we have adopted this 30%. Adair Turner started today by talking about coalitions and new ways of thinking about change. And Jakob van Weizsäcker mentioned a carbon club. What we're creating here is a methane club with selective benefits, selective incentives for those who are on the inside of the agreement. The agreement really is about measurement, reporting, and verification in the first stage, and then discrimination in the second phase. Once we have sufficient data to make informed choices about who has the best production techniques, then we can start making choices about who we want to trade with in the future. And I think that's something that we would agree with Matt on, that we need good data. The big divide that you see, though, diplomatically, is between those who want to have good data and those that are not so keen on good data. And that is going to be the difficulty for the future. It's very clear that the institutions like the International Methane Emissions Observatory need broad-based support. To have an independent assessment of methane emissions is very necessary for having effective action. But if you do not fund or support that independent assessment, a global methane pledge of reducing 30% by 2030 has little practical little practical importance. So we need very much to have good data. If we have good data, we can make this alternative way of thinking about how to bring down short-lived climate pollutants work. The threat of using trade issues as a way to persuade other countries to implement methane emissions reductions clearly works. We have 43 countries, including the European Union and the United States, with this pledge already. We have some countries to go, but I think it will be successful at COP. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Yvan Champagne, you are working for a firm which objective is turning carbon challenges into opportunities. So on methane, whose phasing out necessitate the active participation of firms concerned. In a nutshell, what do you think is key to get them mobilized?
Merci beaucoup, Edmond. So I've been asked to speak on mobilization for the private sector. And for me, my message comes down to 5 M's. The first is mobilization. The second is markets. The third is methane. The fourth is mitigation. And the last one is momentum. So on mobilization of the private sector, it's absolutely critical. To a large extent, our challenge on emissions have been created by the private sector, and I believe the private sector can be the major driver in solving the problem. And how do we mobilize? Well, we need markets, and I mean markets plural. Article 6, the rule book, is going to be critical, but we need more than Article 6. We need IMO, we need CORSIA, we need the UER markets, and I believe that markets are absolutely critical in mobilizing. excuse me. And this is based on my experience in mobilizing 40 oil and gas companies over the last 3 years in Canada to replace 12,000 pieces of methane emitting equipment in less than 3 years. It's based on my experience in executing large methane reduction projects right now in the Middle East, leveraging the strong price signal that's available in the UER markets in Europe. Markets will work. The third piece is, I would say, on methane. Markets are especially effective, and there's a few reasons for that. And I think it's specifically important for oil and gas related methane. Due to the high GWP value of methane, and if you combine it with a strong price signal, it's very easy to catalyze immediate action. And that, I would argue, needs to be our focus right now. Not just targets, but we need to show results. And on results, while I would agree with the very important point that Graciela made earlier around the importance of creating removal markets, Dan, I think, articulated very well why we can't lose focus, especially on the next 10 years, on mitigation. We need to ensure that the molecules don't get in the atmosphere in the first place. It's much cheaper, much more cost effective to do it that way. I think markets have proven to be very effective on mitigation. And then finally, it's momentum. The world is watching right now. We have the world's attention. People are watching net zero pledges. They are watching these targets and commitments that companies and countries are making. But people are wondering, can we do this? Can we actually achieve this? Is this a lost fight? And I think there is some valid questions there. So we need to show, we need to build momentum. And I think on methane, we can do that. It is winnable. We have the technology, specifically on methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. The technology exists today. Combining markets, I think we can do this. And I think the world needs to see that we can get a win. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvon. Now, Julien Perez, the last word. A brief reaction on from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. Julien.
Thanks a lot, Edmond. It's a great pleasure, and thanks a lot for again generating this kind of discussion. It's very important, and I commend your leadership on that. So I just wanted to react a little bit as well from the previous speaker, and what I hear from the speaker is Mr. Fabius and others, is that there is a growing impatience on implementing concrete climate action now. And as Ivan just reiterated, this impatience is becoming even more pregnant as we get close to the COP26. So, Dan and Matt made the point, methane is a quick win, if not the quickest win, due to the capacity of a reduced flow to reduce the stock of methane in the atmosphere very fast, and the fact that it has a high global warming potential. So acting on methane, I feel, could satisfy at least partially such impatience. And I would say that, working with the oil and gas industry, we could also feel that there is a very strong impatience toward the oil and gas industry to act. Some are blaming or giving up on the industry. This impatience is understandable, but I personally believe, and we believe within the GCI, that we'll not succeed in tackling climate change if we ignore the oil and gas industry, if we decide to work against them rather than working with them. And this is what the GCI is about, working with the industry to turn them into a change agent of the low carbon transition. So now coming on the methane, which is one of the key topics of GCI since its inception in 2014. So the methane for the oil and gas is estimated to represent roughly 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This is 4% of man-made emission or 6% of energy-related emissions. So it's a significant portion of the challenge. And again, it's one of the quickest wins that we could achieve. As it has been said as well, a large share of emission of the oil and gas operation are technically possible to avoid, and probably more than half would typically be avoidable at no net cost. And so this is a proportion that would probably increase considering the elevated gas price that we observe today. So how we do that? There are 3 components that we expand within GCI. One is about leadership. So for instance, we've set, so GCI is bringing together CEOs of international and national companies, representing roughly 30% of the production. And so when we launch, an announcement, it's obviously heard by the rest of the industry. And 3 years ago, we launched a target that we have just revisited to well below 0.20% of the methane intensity, because we have achieved it earlier than what we were expecting. And that resulted to 20 million tons of CO2 equivalent, so 4 million cars, to give an example. And the trend of reduction is in the order of reduction of the global methane pledge that Brendan just talked about, and that we very much welcome this type of international initiative, because that supports our roadmap to net zero on our operation. I would say the second component is about technology, and again, Matt also made the point. There is a wide diversity of technology today that are available, and we are developing them and deploying them through our investment fund. We can talk about satellite, drone, and airplanes to detect and fix the methane emission, but as well as improving the estimation. I would say the third pillar of our action is to collaborate and support, because 85% of the production is made by national oil companies or independent producer, not the majors. So we have to collaborate with them. And to give an example, we've just launched a satellite data acquisition in Iraq to inform local players and governments, or we run master classes on methane emission in various developing parts of the world, or having partnership with institutions such as the World Bank, the UN, or the NGOs. This is a very global issue, and we need to expand the knowledge and incentivize action. And the last part I would say is also to collaborate with this type of institutions and countries to enable direct and indirect regulation to tackle methane emission.
Thank you, Julien. Now, we come to the important issue of climate change and emerging countries, which rightly point out that the bulk of the existing stock of carbon in the atmosphere comes from developed countries. So Joachim Levy, you have the floor for a few minutes, 5 minutes, no more, please. Joachim.
Hey, thank you. And let me join others to really praise your leadership in bringing together this important conversation. Well, we know that energy consumption is responsible for about 2/3 of global emissions from fossil fuels. Energy demand, notably electricity, will continue to grow in coming decades, especially in emerging markets and developing economies, where electricity will more than double according to the International Energy Agency. Fortunately, even considering the the state policies, most of this increase will be achieved using renewable energies. And in the announced pledges case, they would correspond to 70% of total electricity in 2050. And the good news, as it was mentioned before, is that renewables are already the cheapest sources of expanding capacity in many countries. In China, Brazil, Chile, many other places, the potential to expand solar and wind power in an integrated fashion is quite large, especially when hydropower is repurposed and used as a buffer or battery for the system. And considering the electrification of transport, even household heat, the impact of renewables on total emissions in these countries can be sizable and the transition affordable. Regulations will, of course, be fundamental to such an outcome, helping integrating markets and fostering competition while providing long-term signals. And well-designed national carbon prices, carbon markets, can help in the process by providing some of these signals. Also, global trade on green hydrogen at the heels of the carbon prices in Europe, for instance, can stimulate the development of renewables in tropical countries, fostering electricity production for export, but also for domestic consumption. And I believe that we're going to have an increasing role in G20 countries where emerging markets, developing nations are represented, particularly because of the nature of this repeated game that is played among finance ministers and even governments in the G20. And this will help foster commitments. Now, along these good things, there are nonetheless important development countries where the commitment to green is strong, but the transition is not easy. And in this respect, and from a global cooperation standpoint, channeling resources to facilitate the transition of countries such as India out of coal is probably among the most effective ways to reduce emissions in the next 10, 15 years. And infrastructure will remain a crucial part of economic activity in developing countries, even in China, highlighting the challenge of reducing emissions from steel and cement production. And here I note that in coming years, carbon prices will certainly, a new technology will certainly have a role. I would venture also that in several cases, they can help promote nature-based solutions that can make a difference. And this is not talked very often, but here I cite a few examples. For instance, in Brazil, charcoal from planted forests together with electricity from renewables already yield a net zero steel, and that can be promoted, especially with a small carbon price and recognition in any camp schemes. This could be very competitive with traditional steel and bring many social co-benefits. Also, palm trees from Colombia or Brazil, grown integrated with the forest and supported by modest global carbon prices, can provide affordable additional fuel in the short term. And ethanol from sugarcane feeding hydrogen fuel cells can be an effective solution for transportation, not only in Brazil, but in Africa, India, places where you have or can have sugarcane. And of course, France mentioned in the chat about a new road for wood. Now, what's the importance of all of these? Certainly, is not only the ability to anticipate the reduction of carbon emissions, and you know that a ton of oil today is more valuable than in the future, but also it brings income streams, integrate populations, some often low income populations in many of the developing world. So I think that carbon prices can play a very important role as long as they are set at levels that are proportional to the levels of income in these countries, are accompanied by financial support and flows from advanced countries towards developing countries that are dependent on coal, as was mentioned by others, and they recognize the merit of nature-based solutions that can buy time to the world until other technologies are available. These, I think, can really help and motivate emerging markets and accelerate their path towards net zero emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim. You opened the way to the question I am raising now to Victor Gaspar. Victor, you reminded us that James Rolfe of the IMF presented to us in a previous meeting a proposal of 3 different prices of carbon in the world, its level, which means its burden, being lower for emerging countries, exactly what Joachim is asking for. So how carbon pricing could help meet the necessary solidarity from developed countries? Please, Victor, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Edmond. This is a very important topic, and let me give you the finance angle. One of the main themes of the annual meetings last week was the great finance divide. If we look at what happened to public debt and non-financial corporate debt and household debt in 2020, we see that China and the advanced economies contributed more than 90% to the increase in the level of debt in the world, while low-income countries contributed negligible amounts to the increase of debt in the world. It turns out that COVID-19 and climate change impact strongest the poorest and most vulnerable. And that leads to the way this was considered in the Paris Climate Agreement. the Paris Climate Agreement speaks about common but differentiated responsibilities. So when we were thinking about this international carbon price floor, we thought that there would be room for differentiation. And in the paper that you were kind enough to quote, Edmond, we show how that can be effective. But of course, if finance would be available to the extent it was agreed in Paris and perhaps over and above what was agreed in Paris and coupled with technological transfer as well, the case for less differentiation could be made. And as Joaquin was saying, that would allow for more efficient solutions to be adopted at the global level.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Jérôme Ramesh. Your view from India, please, Jérôme.
Well, I think one of the great breakthroughs in India in the last decade has been to make the transition to solar, particularly. When I was minister, we used to pay 15 rupees a unit for solar power, and today we are putting up solar power plants at less than 3 rupees a unit. So there has been a dramatic transformation, and I have no doubt in my mind that by the year 2030, over 50% of our electricity supply, not capacity, will come from non-fossil fuels. However, the conundrum remains for large economies like India, which are growing economies, which have developmental imperatives, demographic pressures. The conundrum remains, where is the baseload electricity going to come from? It's all very well to say we're going to go for green electricity, but where is the baseload electricity going to come from? And in the absence of any dramatic breakthrough in energy storage in the next few years, I'm afraid there is going to be no alternative to nuclear. And I hate to say this, there's going to be no alternative, although perhaps on a declining trajectory. So I think this baseload problem remains a big problem for countries like India. Certainly it remains a conundrum for India. And while certainly we need to move on a phase down strategy as far as coal is concerned, to start thinking of a phase out strategy today in a reasonable time frame is unrealistic. But having said this, let me say that sectoral shifts are certainly possible. And I, for example, am perfectly willing, and I've stuck my neck out and said that by the year 2035, India should actually announce that no internal combustion engine cars are going to be sold, that no petrol or diesel cars will be sold in India or manufactured in India after 2035. So there are these sectoral things that are certainly doable, but at the economy-wide level, I'm afraid we have to still continue to rely on nuclear with all its attendant problems, and perhaps coal, but at a declining level. One very quick final point, Edmund, one very quick final point. I've been on many occasions with OECD discussions on CBAM. Now, there's been a big discussion on CBAM this evening. And, I feel that CBAM is no CBM. It's not a confidence building measure as far as climate is concerned, because it is still seen as a protectionist tool. It is still seen as a trade avoidance, trade distorting, trade obstructing device. And the point that Lord Adair made is absolutely crucial. How are you going to use the revenues that you're going to collect from a CBAM? And therefore, greater clarity on the structure of the CBAM, and certainly some clarity on how the resources generated from the CBAM are going to be used as part of this global climate finance corpus, I think would go a long way in reducing suspicions of CBAM. Right now, there is tremendous suspicion on CBAM.
Thank you for this very clear presentation, Jérôme. We will have to work together a lot. because your country is key in the future, as many others, by the way, but even more than many others. And you know why? Because the development of China in the future will be tremendous. And I hope that for your country, for the well-being of Indians. But by the way, you will need a major increase in the demand for energy. There will be. And obviously coal will be the problem. And you know that, and you clearly exposed that. And so we have to talk about that because we need to win this battle against global warming. And this is one of the problems we face with others. We will talk about that. And thank you for your position on nuclear, which is very important. Now, Zhuang Zhongyong, China is in a particular position because it is still an emerging country, but a major industrial one as well. So, your comment.
Thank you. Very glad to have this opportunity to join this conversation. I think I very much agree with what the previous speakers have said on the emerging market's role in achieving the Paris Agreement. Now, China has announced its 2 carbon goals, peaking before 2030 and achieving neutrality before 2060. China has also announced that it will strictly control coal consumption growth during the next 5 years and gradually reduce coal consumption from 2025. Now, these are, very bold commitments. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize that China is facing tremendous challenges in moving towards these 2 goals. As you said, China is still a developing country and it needs continued strong growth to improve living standards of its larger population. So this makes it very challenging for China to reduce total energy consumption. This is the largest source of emissions. To the time span, I think the time span from carbon peaking to neutrality for China is about 30 years. Significantly shorter than 70 years for many European countries. So this requires China to undergo low carbon transition really in an unprecedented speed. 3, there's a significant uncertainty over the availability of new technologies in the future, as we discussed earlier sessions. Now, despite these challenges, China will have to make every effort to achieve the 2 carbon goals, because China's success is critical for the global fight against climate change, and is also important for its own high quality development. Now, carbon pricing is important. We have a lot of discussions. I think China recently announced a national emission trading system. I think it will play a very important role in ensuring that emission reduction will be achieved in a cost-effective way, despite of course it needs to be improved in many aspects in the coming years. While carbon pricing is important, but I think technology innovation is also critical. In this regard, I think it's very important that countries support each other in green technology development through greater technology cooperation, especially between developed countries and developing countries, since we're in the same boat, and also in consideration of the common but differentiated responsibilities. Let me stop from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhongyong. Now, the last but not least topic of our discussion, which is a major problem when it comes to fighting climate change. It concerns all countries around the world. On the eve of Glasgow COP26, raising this issue of global leadership is highly topical. So let me ask as the first speaker to Laurent Fabius, whose legitimacy to speak on this subject is undeniable, to take the floor. So Laurent, you have the floor.
Thank you, Edmund. And first, many thanks to you, because I think it is a very useful discussion. And obviously we shall have to have new discussion, but it is really useful and it is due to your leadership. Therefore, congratulations. About Glasgow, what strikes me in our discussion, it is particularly 2 or 3 themes. Many of us have insisted, and I share this view, on the fact that Glasgow has to deliver, not to deliver in what will happen in 30 or 40 years. Obviously, it's very important. But what people are expecting is what one of us has called the doables, 2020s, 2030s. And I think our friends in Glasgow must try and insist on that. That's the first thing that strikes me. The second thing, which is crystal clear, is that methane can be the good surprise of Glasgow, if I may say so. Obviously, all of us, we are discussing about CO2, but with methane, which is very important in terms of reality, in terms of figures, we can deliver. It has been clearly explained by some of our friends. And therefore, I think that all of us must insist when preparing the last moments of Glasgow on this aspect too. And the third thing about Glasgow, and it is related to all of what we have discussed, is that we need measurement. We need transparency in the different sectors, because it's only transparency which builds trust. And we need trust in Glasgow, and we need more trust at an international level. This being said, let's come back on carbon pricing and on what you call the global leadership. Obviously, there are different tools. Obviously, for the different governments, and especially in present times, it is what one of us called a hot potato. But obviously, too, there is a growing interest all around the world about carbon pricing. In fact, we have quoted carbon pricing in the Paris Agreement, but at that time, it was not, if I may say so, mature. If you are curious, you will see that in paragraph 136 of the decision, it's not the first paragraph, it's 136. We have said in Paris, the Conference of the Parties recognizes the important role of providing incentives for emission reduction activities, including tools such as domestic policies and carbon pricing. Okay, but at that time, it was very audacious. But now it's fundamental. And I would say that even there is no explicit decision in Glasgow about carbon pricing, it will be a key element of the background of Glasgow, of all the issues which will be discussed and decided in Glasgow. Now, what is the responsibility of the main powers? It has been clearly shown that we do not need a unique system everywhere. And I totally share with my experience of COP22 the necessity of taking into account the famous principle of CBDR, because otherwise we shall not be in a situation to deliver. And some words which have been pronounced are very realistic. The way, not carbon pricing, but CBAM is welcome in some countries, especially different countries. It's a difficult thing. And therefore, we have to take that into consideration. But I think there is a particular responsibility of Europe, sure, Europe, because it has insisted on that. It won't be easy within Europe itself because of political reason, but Europe has to be clear and to take decision in the coming future. In US, there are discussions about carbon tax. There are discussions about carbon border adjustment. It's not clear, and maybe there is a difference between the position of politicians and the position of the different companies. And in China, obviously, it's very important that China has decided a carbon price. It's low, but it can grow and grow. And it's very important too, what has been said about CCS regarding CBAM. We have to discuss with our Chinese friend, with our American friend, with our Indian friends, because we cannot impose a system which would be unique. But we have undoubtedly to prepare an agreement. The question of where the revenue go will be decisive. And Ada has been right in saying there are several possibilities: innovation, social justice for every country, financing developing countries, and it would make a difference. But that's what international diplomacy is about. Therefore, there will be difficulties. It will take time, but it's really a key question. I like this idea of carbon club. Obviously, the club must be the largest possible. I like the idea of different levels and of a sort of minimum price and maybe 3 tiers. And all these questions must be discussed. And the contribution that our participants can give to the discussion will be very helpful. My final word will be to say that if I compare Paris with Glasgow, I mean the general background, I often say that Paris' success was not due to the quality of the presidency. No, it was due to the situation with the conjunction of 3 planets: science, society, and states. Today, science is quite okay. Society, I mean, well, there have been improvements, but in some key sectors, it's more difficult. And but about states, we must honestly recognize that the situation is not at all the same as it was in Paris. And therefore, it is the reason why Glasgow and our continuous efforts are so important. I will summarize in saying that in Paris, the main thing was to bring a victory over climate skepticism. And it has been done. And nobody today can pretend that climate warming does not exist. But this time, we have to have a victory over climate fatalism. And it will not be achieved only by discussion. We need to deliver acts. We need to show that it is possible. We need to be honest, but still to be ambitious. And I think our way of discussing can be helpful after Glasgow, as well as it is useful before. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurent. So Zhu Jiang, the former Vice President of the World Bank, your own position on this major issue, please.
Thank you, Edmund. I think that this is a very useful, important discussion.
and also timely before the upcoming COP26 convention. And so I think that in terms of the required leadership for the agenda of climate change, I believe that the stronger collective leadership should be measured, particularly in the following areas. Number one, I think that the general public globally now probably know a lot, country by country, their commitment towards climate change agenda. However, what is missing is still more actionable, time-bound, and the sector by sector, and the goals and the targets, and that can be really implementable. And I think that this is probably the collective responsibility of stronger leadership, particularly as we have discussed in those and emission-intensive sectors, such as energy, such as transport, and cement, steel, whatsoever. I think public needs the specifics so that eventually in time-bound actions, these things can be implemented rather than just a political statement. So that I see is number one, the strong leadership collectively before the COP26. Secondly, we have to remember in the context of ongoing globally in many countries, the energy shortage and energy crisis, if you say so. I think that the leadership is required really to confirm, to affirm that we stay in the course firmly on climate change. We should not really roll back, even though I think that country by country, we need to address the ongoing problems of energy crisis, but also at the same time, we need to be strategically engaged with the global agenda on climate change, rather than try to push things back in order to to really solve these sort of temporary problems. Number three, I think is financing, particularly from emerging and developing countries. And financing is also critical, providing what is needed to implement even at the national levels, the goals on the climate change. At the same time, providing a signal, really globally, people care together with the sort of difficulties, particularly with the low-income countries in fulfilling the financing gap. Last but not least, we talk a lot about the climate change related technology. My own point is certainly technology development innovations and should be driven by private sector, by business communities. But on the other hand, given the important externalities, the government have a role to play there to support more strongly the technology and the utilization, application, but also important commercialization. As some early speakers just said, in terms of storage, in terms of CCS, if these things can be accelerated with a stronger support or the strong incentive, and then I think that the global agenda can be really achieved much early on. So I think that the global leadership collectively really required for the following areas, among others, as I indicated. Let's be a sort of a supporter of stronger collective leadership before the COP26, both from Europe, from China, other emerging market countries, and also from US. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. May I ask Martin Wolf to make his comments, because I think he has to leave now. Please, Martin.
Yeah, I have unfortunately another meeting.
Please, you're welcome.
My remarks are pretty simple. I'm not an expert like all the others. I found this a wonderful discussion, very rich and fruitful. I've learned some things which are going to be very helpful in future writing. My basic conclusion is, however, more or less what I came into with this, that from a technical point of view, there are many routes we can take which can probably deliver a transformation of our economic situation and our energy system in the time required. But the changes are incredibly dramatic and have to happen very, very quickly. And I still feel we are very, very far short of the needed urgency in decision making. And we have really very wide differences among our nations in what is feasible. So I would just recommend to all the participants what I myself feel is that anything close to complacency about what will happen is obviously impossible. And we have to recognize that this is going to be an incredibly difficult thing to pull off in aggregate across the world.
That's very, very important. Thank you very much, Martin. Very important. Gerasimos Thomas, one of the most influential executives of the European Commission. Don't you think that the European Union could be more assertive given its credential on climate change? Gerasimos, please.
Thank you very much, Edmund, and congratulations for the event. I'm sorry I could not join from the very beginning, but I participated in the last couple of panels, and it's been very enriching, the discussion. So I think Laurent Fabius mentioned that we have to focus on doables by 2030. This is very much what we have decided in the EU with our Fit for 55 package. We try to define at EU level what is possible for each member state to deliver in terms of concrete contribution to greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And this package of measures that we have proposed is still under discussions, but I think one has to recognize that Europe let's say, decided to do the first mover advantage or disadvantage, that we are taking risks with their proposals, risks for Europe, potentially creating questions around our partners, but I think we are focusing on the doables. We had to do that, let's remember ourselves, we have to do it because our public opinion is very much on the side of climate change. 93% of our citizens see climate change as a serious challenge and problem, and 78% thinks that it is a very serious problem. So we have, let's say, the different countries and the different governments around Europe, despite the difficulties, they do have, let's say, an overall positive public opinion worry to respond to. Now, it is evident that COP26 has to deal with climate finance issues, with financing and LDCs. We are at the year that this issue has to be tackled along other issues. We have eliminated probably climate skepticism. As far as Europe is concerned, we are not on the climate fatalism spectrum of the debate. I think at the international level, we are positive that the debate is moving forward. In the G7, there has been a recognition at the level of the G7 that carbon pricing and carbon leakage are issues that need to be discussed. At the G20 level, carbon pricing has been recognized as an issue to be discussed. So we have a renewed interest, let's say, from the ministers of finance of the G20 to discuss these issues. I think this is a very positive element in the debate. We were a bit surprised and disappointed that, 3 countries, let's say, they resisted the last week in Washington for the G5 increasing role of the finance ministers G20 in these issues of carbon pricing and border measures. I think this is something that we need to overcome. We need to have support from the G20 membership to have a discussion at the ministers of finance level around these issues of carbon pricing and carbon leakage, to the way that it is relevant. But carbon pricing is the most important issue, and I think this is something that we need to fight. On the positive side, I think we have a new wealth of literature and analysis that it is supporting the debate. And I think this provides new evidence in order to make a good policy decision. And last but not least, on the positive side, we have an active engagement in international diplomacy. The EU is very much involved it's obviously a part of the bilateral agenda with the new Biden administration. This is very important. It has provided new impetus to the discussion. We are engaging a lot with China. We are engaging a lot with Indonesia, the future G20 presidency, and we are engaging with all partners. There is ground for optimism. We have to accept that the speed of needed action leads us sometimes to suboptimal solutions. I mean, we are so late in dealing with climate that we have to use a variety of tools, and sometimes we have to use second best tools and play with incentives and disincentives. And I think if we had this discussion 10 years ago, we would have proposed or argued for different solutions. But I think sometimes this is missing from the debates, that we have to be brutal in the use of a variety of tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerasimos. Thank you very much for these comments. Jérôme, a short comment. Jérôme.
Well, I think, Edmund, finally, I would just say that we need a new architecture. We need a COP plus architecture. This architecture where we wait for November or December and expect that in those 10 days, the negotiators and the ministers and the heads of state or heads of government are going to deliver the goods, has really run its course. And we need 24/7 by 365 architecture. Now, the Methane Club, is an example of a good architecture. The idea of a climate club has been mooted. I think we need series of climate clubs depending on the doables that we are focusing on. So we need to have more flexible architectures. We are locked into this the COP architecture, which has really become, frankly, in my view, dysfunctional from the point of view of delivering desired outcomes at the desired pace. So you need to be more creative. You need, of course, this agreement is a multilateral agreement, but we need to create a series of plurilateral windows in the overall framework of a multilateral agreement. And we have examples, the WTO, for example. We have multiple agreements under the rubric of a multilateral agreement, which are plurilateral in nature. So I think we need to think creatively now of adding to the COP structure. The COP can remain at the top, but throughout the year, you need the G20, you need the G7, you need to create a new G5 of China, USA, Europe, Russia, and India, the top 5 emitters. So you need to think creatively about new institutional forms. And that's, I think, really the main message that I want to convey.
Thank you. Thank you, Jérôme. But this initiative we have been taking with the IFF is a very small window, but it's a window anyhow. So, Jacob von Weizsäcker, on this issue, as on many others, the European decision-making in Europe, in this European decision-making, Germany's position is always very important. So please, give us your own reaction on this issue of global governance.
Yes, Edmond, it's really very kind of you, and given what Laurent Fabius, what Jairam Ramesh, it's wonderful to see you and have said on the relation between the of course hugely successful COP26 architecture, Paris Agreement, but then of course the need to do things in addition to that at the level of the G7, at the level of G20. I couldn't possibly agree more. And I think what Germany's role in next year's G7 presidency is going to make certain that we really build G7 momentum, not least in view of what I mentioned earlier, the climate club idea. And I think it's quite remarkable, and really kudos to Gerasimos and Benjamin for having engineered a CBAM that, if you look at it more closely, gives us 5 years before actually the CBAM starts, properly speaking, because it's only set to start in 2026. So I think this time really needs to be used well. And I think that, broadly speaking, the setup is very clever. And many thanks really for the European Commission to have built in this, if you like, time window of opportunity to deal with some of these issues within the G7. It's of course very much a game transatlantically, where Canada, when you talk to them, of course, they're very much on board because they have similar issues, very ambitious climate agenda, a very ambitious agenda on carbon pricing, highly energy intensive economy, and of course, even more trade exposure to the US, where we've heard that for time being, for political reasons, it's difficult to introduce a national carbon price. So I think that's the transatlantic agenda is going to loom large in the G7, but we are hopeful that we can really push the envelope on that. And then one of the greatest news, of course, last week at the annual meetings in DC was Indonesia, the future G20 presidency, reiterating time again that they're introducing, of course, a national carbon price, which I think bodes well for the ability, and clearly there are some difficulties, but for the ability of the G20 then really to become the forum for that agenda as it needs to be. And I quite like, even though Martin Wolf has now left, I quite liked his analogy a little bit with global minimum taxation, that it was possible after, of course, very good work by the OECD and G20 decision making to come to a conclusion. It was a multiple year process. Clearly, this is also going to be a multiple year process, but I think that's a way to, of course, build the alliance with the major emerging economies. And then finally, and I think that's also a very important point, thinking about the carbon club idea, of course, one of the advantages, if we were to manage to do it and get a critical mass, would be that within that architecture, certain sectoral solutions, where, for example, a low-income economy says, well, we'd really like to join the carbon club, but we have a sectoral issue with, say, 2 steel plants, and they need to be addressed. Then I think it's going to be a lot easier to build an architecture where some of the richer countries are going to say, look, this is a problem that can be solved, because often these are internal political economy problems that are perfectly solvable, and perhaps that also could complement some of the ideas, of course, of the Paris Agreement and COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. Now it's now time to close this conversation, and the concluding remarks will be made by Zhu Jiang on behalf of the International Finance Forum, the co-organizer of this event. Yeah, Jiang, you have the floor.
Thank you again for giving me the floor. And I think that this is a very successful discussion on the carbon pricing, but probably also the agenda extended further to the climate change important issues. I think that I may not be in a position to provide sort of concluding remarks, but rather I think that a few walk away and I myself take and I want to share. I think that probably in order to keep the momentum, we probably need to go further with the discussions and also analysis on the motivations, incentives, and also the market mechanism for the agenda. So carbon pricing, or in a larger extent, not only carbon pricing, but carbon taxes, the carbon price floors, and also, as some previous speakers said, comparison to the global minimum corporate tax mechanism. These things, if really can be further analyzed and discussed in an open-minded manner, not immediately put into the national positions, but rather technically providing further analysis on the pros and the cons, implications for different economies. I think that probably will be very useful moving forward. So that's also my suggestion to say on behalf of International Finance Forum, if we all agree largely on that sort of extended carbon pricing agenda, let's make a further effort so that eventually for the climate change agenda, people see that the value additions analytically, but also potential implementable actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiang. We will certainly, with the International Finance Forum, go further next year. Our next agenda for 2022 of work together will be built on this excellent conversation. So this is the end of the event, which will be put online. And thank you so much to all of you, all the speakers, and also all those who contributed to its organization. And I hope that it will be a fruitful contribution to the Glasgow COP26. I wish you all the best to all of you. And I should say good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. And thank you very much for participating to this international global conversation, which was really, in my view, extremely interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone.
Organization. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
For all the contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Edmund.
you, Joanna.
Nina.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.